the stench of burning flesh mixed with perfume. This was the scent that filled Prince Kael's bedchamber as his kingdom died. Outside the palace walls, children screamed as iron collars snapped around their necks, while inside, the prince lay entangled in silk sheets, still drunk on pleasure from the night before. The woman beside him, her beauty now revealed as something otherworldly and terrible, traced a finger along the treaty that bore his seal. "You were magnificent last night, your highness," she purred, as the first slave ships appeared on the horizon. Every gasp, every shudder, was worth exactly what you paid 3,000,000 souls. But this wasn't how Prince Kael of Arvath had imagined his reign would end. Just one day earlier, he had been the youngest ruler of the most prosperous kingdom in the eastern realms. Arvath, the jewel of the coast, had stood for 800 years as a beacon of learning, trade, and culture. Its libraries held the wisdom of ages, its markets overflowed with exotic goods, and its people lived free under laws that even visiting merchants envied. Kael himself had been hailed as the Golden Prince. Handsome, educated, trained in swordsmanship and statecraft since childhood. On his coronation day, just 3 years prior, the crowds had cheered themselves hoarse, believing their beloved prince would usher in a new age of glory. How did a prince groomed for greatness, heir to 8 centuries of prosperity, transform into history's most reviled traitor in a single night? What force could compel a man to trade 3,000,000 lives for fleeting ecstasy? The answer lies not just in one moment of weakness, but in a perfect storm of debt, desire, and deception that would forever change the meaning of betrayal. The kingdom of Arvath sat at the crossroads of 3 continents, its harbors commanding the most lucrative trade routes in the known world. For generations, this geographic blessing had made Arvath wealthy beyond measure. But wealth attracts predators. To the north, the Carathian Empire had been expanding for decades, swallowing smaller kingdoms with a combination of military might and economic manipulation. To the south, the merchant princes of Valasa controlled banking networks that could strangle a nation's economy with a few sealed letters. And from within, a cancer had been growing: corruption among the nobility, excessive spending on monuments and pleasures, and a military that had grown soft on peace and prosperity. When Kael inherited the throne at 22, he also inherited a secret that his advisors had hidden from the public. Arvath was drowning in debt. The previous king, Kael's father, had borrowed heavily to maintain the kingdom's golden facade. Loans from Valasian banks carried interest rates that doubled every 5 years. Trade agreements with Carathia included hidden clauses that slowly transferred control of key ports. The kingdom's treasury, once overflowing, contained more promissory notes than actual gold. Young Kael, brilliant in many ways but untested in the brutal realities of statecraft, found himself holding a kingdom that was beautiful on the surface but rotting from within. The true horror of what was to come had been foreshadowed in small ways. Merchants whispered of strange new clauses in trade agreements, provisions for human collateral if debts went unpaid. Foreign ambassadors spoke casually of labor reorganization in conquered territories, a euphemism for mass enslavement. In the border towns, families had begun disappearing in the night, only to resurface in chain gangs building roads for Carathian legions. But in the palace, surrounded by luxury and sycophantic courtiers, Prince Kael remained blissfully unaware of the tightening noose. He spent his days in council meetings discussing abstract numbers, his evenings in revelry with the young nobles who assured him that Arvath's glory was eternal. Even as the kingdom's creditors began to circle like vultures, even as enemy armies massed at the borders, the prince believed that his charm, his intelligence, and his royal blood would somehow prevail. Little did Prince Kael know that his enemies had been studying him as carefully as they had studied Arvath's weaknesses. They knew of his pride, his fear of being seen as weak, his appetite for pleasure that bordered on addiction. They knew that the young prince, for all his education, had one fatal flaw. He believed himself cleverer than everyone else in the room. And so they prepared a trap that would use his own arrogance against him, a honeyed snare that would make him the architect of his people's doom. The mysterious woman who would appear at his court was no chance encounter but the culmination of years of patient planning. What happened next would echo through history as the night when 3 million people learned that their lives were worth less than their prince's desire. Prince Kael's path to infamy began not with malice but with the golden cage of his upbringing. Born during Arvath's most prosperous era, he was raised in the Palace of Eternal Spring, where fountains ran with wine during festivals and the gardens bloomed year-round through ancient magic. His mother died birthing him, leaving King Aldrich to raise his only heir with a mixture of indulgence and distance. The king, consumed by matters of state, delegated his son's upbringing to tutors who competed to praise the prince's every accomplishment. By age 10, Kael could recite epic poems in 12 languages, yet had never seen how common people lived beyond the palace walls. By 15, he had mastered swordplay against instructors forbidden to let him lose, building a dangerous confidence in abilities never truly tested. The first crack in Kael's golden facade appeared during his 18th winter. A harsh freeze destroyed the harvest in Arvath's northern provinces, and delegations of starving farmers traveled to the capital seeking aid. The young prince, serving as his father's representative, received them in the throne room wearing robes worth more than their villages would see in a lifetime. When they described children dying of hunger, Kael responded with a prepared speech about the kingdom's temporary financial constraints, never grasping that the gold thread in his single glove could have fed a family for months. One elderly farmer, driven past propriety by desperation, dared to shout, "Your Highness knows nothing of suffering." Guards dragged him away, but his words echoed in the chamber. Rather than investigating the truth behind the man's accusation, Kael retreated to his chambers, wounded by what he saw as ingratitude for his royal attention. The incident revealed a pattern that would define Kael's rule. When confronted with uncomfortable truths, he chose comfort over comprehension. His tutors, seeing his distress, assured him the farmers were exaggerating. His companions, young nobles who benefited from the status quo, convinced him that maintaining royal dignity was more important than indulging every peasant complaint. The kingdom's treasury secretly sold grain reserves to pay interest on foreign loans, while Kael believed the crisis resolved because the delegations stopped coming, not knowing they had been turned away at the city gates on orders from corrupt ministers who feared the prince might actually try to help if he understood the true scope of the suffering. 3 enabling factors transformed Kael from a merely sheltered prince into the architect of his kingdom's doom. First was the cult of royal infallibility that pervaded Arvath's court. For 8 centuries, the royal bloodline had ruled wisely, creating a mythology that princes were born with inherent wisdom. This belief system discouraged anyone from truly educating Kael about harsh realities, as doing so would admit royal fallibility. Second was the web of corruption that had metastasized through the noble houses. Lords who had grown rich skimming from tax collections and selling government positions had every incentive to keep the prince distracted and pliable. They fed his appetites for pleasure, encouraged his belief in easy solutions, and shielded him from anyone who might open his eyes. Third, and most damaging, was Kael's own intelligence. Sharp enough to master whatever interested him, but directed entirely toward pleasurable pursuits rather than the grinding work of governance. The early victims of Kael's ignorance were invisible to the palace but numerous in the kingdom's struggling provinces. When Carathian trade inspectors began operating in border towns, local magistrates who protested their aggressive tactics found themselves replaced by men who understood the value of cooperation. These inspectors introduced new efficiency measures in the mines and factories. Children as young as 8 working 16-hour shifts, workers beaten for failing to meet impossible quotas, families separated to prevent organized resistance. The reports that reached Prince Kael's desk were masterfully sanitized, speaking of increased productivity and modernized operations. On his single tour of the eastern provinces at age 20, handlers ensured he saw only model villages populated by well-paid actors, while authentic settlements were cleared from his route. The prince returned to court boasting of Arvath's prosperity, never knowing that thousands had been driven from their homes to create his illusion. By the time King Aldrich died and Kael ascended to the throne, the kingdom teetered on a precipice invisible from the palace heights. Foreign agents had infiltrated every level of government, debt payments consumed 60% of tax revenues, and entire regions operated as de facto Carathian protectorates. But the coronation was magnificent. A week-long festival that emptied what remained of the treasury while proclaiming Arvath's eternal glory. Prince Kael, now King Kael, stood before his people radiating confidence, believing every flattering word spoken about his destiny to surpass his ancestors. In the shadows, his creditors smiled and sharpened their knives. The boy king who thought himself clever was exactly the ruler they had been waiting for. The stage was set for the arrival of a mysterious woman who would offer him everything he thought he wanted, at a price he couldn't begin to comprehend. The treaty that Prince Kael signed in his pleasure-drunk haze contained provisions that transformed Arvath from a kingdom into a vast torture chamber. The Karathian Empire had perfected the art of breaking entire populations, and their methods went far beyond simple chains and whips. The collar system they implemented was a masterwork of calculated cruelty. Iron rings forged with corrupted magic that tightened whenever the wearer felt hope. Children watched their parents scream as thoughts of escape or resistance triggered the collar's grip. The metal was designed to rust slowly into the skin, creating infections that kept victims weak but alive. Special variants for skilled artisans included needle-thin spikes that pressed into the throat, allowing just enough movement to work but making every swallow agony. The collars couldn't be removed without killing the wearer, as barbed hooks grew inward over time, intertwining with bone and sinew. Beyond the collars, the Karathians employed architectural torture on a massive scale. Arvath's famous libraries were converted into re-education centers, where scholars were forced to burn their own life's work or watch their families suffer. The grand amphitheaters that once hosted plays and music became processing centers where families were separated according to a brutal calculus. Strong adults to the mines, attractive youth to comfort houses, children to training camps where they learned to inform on their parents. The very buildings seemed to weep as their purpose was perverted. Acoustic chambers designed for perfect musical performances were used to amplify screams until prisoners begged for deafness. The Palace of Justice's marble halls, where fair trials once upheld Arvath's laws, became auction blocks where humans were examined like livestock, their teeth checked, their muscles prodded, their worth calculated in gold coins. The slavers introduced devices specifically designed to break Arvathian pride. The Wheel of Remembrance forced victims to turn massive grinding stones while images of their former lives were projected before them. Weddings, harvests, children playing, always just out of reach. Those who slowed were lashed, but worse was the psychological torment of seeing everything they'd lost. The Karathians had studied Arvathian culture carefully, learning that family bonds were paramount, so they created the choice chambers. Parents were forced to decide which child would eat that day, spouses made to compete in degrading tasks to earn medicine for their partner. The methods were designed not just to extract labor but to shatter the social bonds that might enable resistance. Even small mercies became weapons. A cup of clean water given to one prisoner meant another went thirsty, creating resentment and destroying solidarity. The psychology behind these methods revealed a diabolical understanding of human nature. Karathian efficiency experts had studied conquered populations for generations, perfecting techniques that maximized both productivity and despair. They understood that physical pain had limits, bodies grew numb, minds dissociated. But hope, constantly kindled and crushed, created a special kind of suffering that never dulled. They allowed families to stay together just close enough to see each other's degradation but never touch. They instituted mercy days, once a month where restrictions eased slightly, just enough to remind slaves what they'd lost. The torturers themselves were often slaves from previously conquered lands, forced to inflict on others what had been done to them, perpetuating cycles of trauma that the Karathians found both economical and amusing. The case of master craftsman Henrik and his family illustrated the thoroughness of Karathian cruelty. Henrik had been Arvath's most celebrated jeweler, creator of the crown Prince Kael wore to his coronation. On the first day of occupation, soldiers dragged Henrik's family from their workshop. His wife Mara, once lady-in-waiting to the queen, was fitted with a collar that constricted whenever she tried to speak above a whisper, punishment for her noble airs. Their daughter Elisa, 16 and betrothed to a merchant's son, was marked for a comfort house but first forced to watch her parents' humiliation. Henrik himself was taken to the former royal mint, now a slave factory, where he was made to forge the very collars that would enslave his people. The Carathians broke his fingers one by one, then healed them with corrupted magic that left constant pain, ensuring his work would be both exquisite and agonizing. When he tried to forge a flaw into a batch of collars that might allow escape, they brought Elisa before him and demonstrated what her fate would be if he showed further defiance. The public nature of suffering served as its own form of torture. Market squares where children once played became exhibition grounds for punishment. Citizens were forced to watch as their former leaders were broken systematically. The high priest who had blessed Prince Kael's crown was made to recite Carathian prayers while his sacred texts burned. The general who had assured the prince that Arvath's armies could defend against any threat was forced to train Carathian soldiers in Arvathian combat techniques, while wearing chains that calculated the weight of his betrayal, growing heavier with each lesson taught. The spectacles weren't mere cruelty but psychological warfare, demonstrating that everything Arvathians had believed in, their gods, their strength, their civilization, was powerless against Carathian might. The audiences weren't allowed to look away or show sympathy. Those who wept were noted for additional attention. Children were given front-row positions to ensure the next generation grew up knowing nothing but submission. Behind each device, each calculated humiliation, was a simple truth that made the horror complete. This system hadn't been created for Arvath. The Carathians had perfected these methods over centuries, tested on a dozen conquered peoples, refined through the suffering of millions. Arvath was simply the latest victim of an empire that had transformed cruelty into science. And at the center of it all was the knowledge that Prince Kael had invited this evil into his kingdom, traded his people's freedom for a single night of pleasure. That fact was repeated endlessly to the slaves, carved into the walls of their barracks, whispered by guards during moments of false kindness. Your prince sold you for a woman's touch. The psychological torture of that betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, ensuring that even if bodies someday healed, spirits would remain forever scarred. Among the 3 million souls condemned by Prince Kael's signature, none suffered more poignantly than Lydia Silvermane, the woman who had taught the prince to read when he was a boy. For 20 years, she had served as the royal library's head archivist, dedicating her life to preserving Arvath's written treasures. She lived quietly with her husband Marcus, a clockmaker, and their twin sons in a modest house near the palace where she'd often brought young Kael books full of heroic tales. The prince had called her Aunt Lydia and spent countless afternoons in her care while his father attended to matters of state. She'd shaped his love of stories, never imagining that she was nurturing the vanity that would one day doom them all. On the night of the treaty, Lydia was cataloging a collection of ancient poems about honor and duty, verses that would be burned the next morning as Carathian soldiers dragged her from between the shelves she'd spent a lifetime protecting. The morning after Kael's fateful night began like a nightmare from which Arvath would never wake. Lydia heard the screams first, distant but growing closer, mingling with the sound of marching boots and breaking doors. Marcus burst into the library, his face pale with terror, shouting that soldiers were seizing people in the streets. Before they could barricade the doors, Carathian forces smashed through, led by a man reading from a scroll that bore the royal seal. By order of your prince, he announced with cruel satisfaction. All citizens of Arvath are now property of the Carathian Empire. Lydia's mind couldn't process the words even as iron collars snapped around her family's necks. She reached for Marcus but was struck down, her fingertips barely brushing his before soldiers wrenched them apart. The twins, Jacob and Johann, barely 17, fought until clubs reduced them to unconsciousness. The last thing Lydia saw before being dragged away was centuries of books being doused with oil, the knowledge of ages becoming kindling for conquest. The torture Lydia endured was crafted specifically for those who had been close to the prince. Carathian interrogators had studied court records, identifying everyone who might have influenced young Kael's education or character. These special prisoners were subjected to enhanced suffering, both as punishment for failing to shape a better ruler and as particularly poignant examples for the general population. Lydia was taken to what had been the Royal Academy, now converted into a breaking facility for intellectuals and artists. Her collar was inscribed with words from stories she'd read to young Kael, tales of noble princes and heroic sacrifices that now mocked her with their irony. For the first 3 days, she was forced to stand in the academy's courtyard, watching as enslaved scholars burned the books she'd spent decades protecting. Each text that went into the flames triggered a pulse from her collar, the magic interpreting her anguish as resistance. When she finally collapsed, they dragged her to a special chamber where the walls were covered with pages from children's books, the very ones she'd used to teach the prince about courage and virtue. The systematic destruction of her identity began with her voice. Karathian specialists had learned that silence broke teachers and storytellers more effectively than screams. They applied a tincture to her throat that made speaking feel like swallowing molten glass, then demanded she recite the stories she'd told young Kael. When she refused, they brought news of her family. Marcus forced to craft timing mechanisms for torture devices, the twins separated and sent to different provinces. The only way to earn information about their fates was to speak through the agony, to corrupt the tales she loved by telling them in a voice destroyed by pain. She croaked out the story of the brave prince who saved his kingdom, each word a betrayal of everything she'd believed. The interrogators recorded her broken recitations, playing them for other prisoners as proof that even Arvath's wisdom could be perverted to serve the empire. Days blended into weeks of this specialized torment, her voice growing weaker until even whispers brought blood. One night, in the depths of her despair, Lydia attempted escape. Not from the facility, which was impossible, but from life itself. She'd hidden a shard of glass from a broken inkwell, planning to open her veins rather than face another day of defilement. But the collar sensed her intent, tightening until she dropped the shard, gasping for breath that barely came. Guards found her unconscious and revived her with the same corrupted healing magic that mended Henrik's fingers. Enough to continue suffering but never enough to truly heal. When she woke, they informed her that her suicide attempt had added years to her family's servitude. The twins would serve an extra decade. Marcus would craft devices for an additional 100 victims. This was the Karathian way. Every act of defiance rippled outward, ensuring that love became a weapon turned against itself. The guilt crushed Lydia more thoroughly than any torture, knowing her moment of weakness had condemned those she'd tried to protect. The chronicle of Lydia's suffering would have remained unknown if not for a fellow prisoner, a young scribe named Damon who memorized her words during their brief moments in the common area. He survived the occupation and later recorded her story, including her final message spoken through ruined vocal cords. "Tell them I loved him once. Tell them I taught him to read, but I never taught him to see." Lydia Silvermane died in the 7th month of captivity, her body finally surrendering when she learned that Jacob had perished in the mines. She was buried in an unmarked grave with thousands of others, but Damon ensured her words survived. They became part of the secret history of Arvath's suffering, whispered among survivors who understood that the deepest wounds came not from chains or collars, but from the knowledge that someone they trusted, someone they'd shaped and loved, had sold them all for a single night's pleasure. Lydia's story was one among millions, each a testament to the personal devastation hidden within the vast machinery of slavery. Ordinary people who woke one morning to find their entire world transformed into hell by the stroke of a prince's quill. The true magnitude of Prince Kael's betrayal only became clear when the Karathian administrators published their first census of new assets. 3,117,000 souls, the entire population of Arvath save for the prince himself, had been condemned to slavery with a single signature. To comprehend this number, consider that it was equivalent to every man, woman, and child in 12 modern cities, enslaved in the span of a single dawn. The Karathians, meticulous in their cruelty, categorized their new property with bureaucratic precision. 890,000 men of working age sent to mines and construction projects, 920,000 women distributed between factories and domestic servitude, 340,000 elderly designated for limited-term labor, a euphemism for being worked to death within months, and most horrifically, 967,000 children under the age of 16, sorted into training programs designed to create a generation that knew nothing but chains. The systematic nature of the enslavement revealed years of Karathian planning that Prince Kael had been too blind to see. Within hours of the treaty's signing, prepositioned forces had moved with choreographed precision. Every major city fell simultaneously, suggesting an intelligence network that had mapped every street, every garrison, every escape route. The operation utilized a three-phase approach that had been refined across dozens of conquered territories. Phase 1. Decapitation of leadership, with anyone holding civil or military rank above a certain level executed or imprisoned before they could organize resistance. Phase 2. Collar distribution, with mobile smithies producing the enslaving devices at a rate of 10,000 per day, prioritizing potential troublemakers identified by embedded spies. Phase 3. Population sorting, using criteria that maximized both immediate productivity and long-term demoralization. Families were deliberately separated according to algorithms that calculated the optimal balance between maintaining enough connection to ensure compliance while preventing the solidarity that might enable rebellion. The infrastructure of suffering materialized with terrifying efficiency. Within a week, Arvath's pastoral countryside was scarred by the construction of processing centers, holding pens, and transport hubs. The Karathians repurposed existing buildings when possible. Temples became auction houses. Schools transformed into indoctrination centers. Hospitals converted to facilities for modifying resistant slaves. New constructions followed standardized designs that could be assembled quickly using slave labor. The transit camps alone could hold 50,000 people at a time, sorted into pens based on destination and purpose. Railroad tracks appeared overnight, laid by the very people who would be transported on them, extending like iron veins to carry Arvath's lifeblood to every corner of the Karathian Empire. The scale defied comprehension. Witnesses reported lines of chained people stretching beyond the horizon, endless columns of humanity being marched toward futures of unrelenting servitude. Different categories of victims faced tailored fates designed to extract maximum value from their suffering. The scholar class, nearly 40,000 strong, was subjected to intellectual slavery, forced to translate their knowledge into forms useful to the empire while watching their original works burn. Arvath's famed merchant families found their expertise in trade perverted into managing slave markets, calculating the monetary value of their former neighbors. The warrior caste, despite Prince Kael's faith in their prowess, had been neutralized through treachery rather than battle, poisoned at farewell feasts the night of the treaty, leaving 30,000 trained soldiers dead before they could draw swords. Those who survived faced a special humiliation, teaching Karathian officers the fighting techniques that had made Arvath's military proud, demonstrating daily their complete helplessness against the empire's might. Artisans suffered perhaps most cruelly, their skills keeping them alive but perverted, jewelers crafting torture devices, architects designing more efficient slave quarters, musicians composing dirges for mass executions. The economics of enslavement transformed Arvath from a prosperous kingdom into a vast profit engine for the Karathian Empire. Conservative estimates suggested that the 3 million slaves represented a value of 900 million gold marks in immediate labor, not counting the ongoing profits from their work. The empire's investment in conquest bribes, spies, military positioning, had cost perhaps 1 million marks over a decade. The return on investment was staggering, and that was before calculating the value of Arvath's confiscated resources, strategic position, and intellectual property. Entire Karathian noble houses bid on contracts to manage different sectors of the slave economy. The Blackwater Consortium won rights to the mines, promising to extract more ore in 5 years than Arvath had produced in 50. The Silkhand Society took control of skilled craftsmen, planning to undercut prices across the continent using slave labor. The mathematics of misery were calculated in ledgers that reduced human suffering to profit margins, treating each scream as simply the sound of coins falling into imperial coffers. The geographic distribution of Arvath's people resembled a diaspora of the damned. The empire's vastness meant that families separated at processing centers might be scattered across distances that would take months to travel, if travel were possible for slaves, which it was not. Mining operations in the frozen north claimed 400,000 souls, where life expectancy was measured in seasons rather than years. The desert quarries of the south swallowed another 300,000, where water was rationed so precisely that workers learned to lick morning dew from their chains. Eastern plantation complexes absorbed 600,000 agricultural workers, their labor feeding the empire's armies while they themselves subsisted on scraps. The imperial heartland claimed 500,000 for factories and households, where proximity to Carathian citizens meant constant humiliation. Port cities throughout the empire received 200,000 for shipyards and docks, their labor building the very vessels that carried more slaves to market. The remaining million were distributed among hundreds of smaller operations, brothels, gladiatorial schools, medical experiments, and purposes too horrific for official records. Maps of the empire began showing Arvathian populations like scattered seeds, each red, representing thousands of people who would never see their homeland again. But who were the monsters capable of orchestrating suffering on such an incomprehensible scale? The answer lay not in a single villain but in an entire society that had transformed cruelty into civilization, and at its head stood figures whose names would echo through history as synonyms for systematic evil. The architect of Arvath's annihilation was not the mysterious woman who seduced Prince Kael, but Emperor Varkon III of Carathia, a man whose genius for cruelty was matched only by his patience. Standing barely 5 feet tall with prematurely white hair and eyes like chips of winter ice, Varkon hardly looked the part of history's great monster. Those who met him at diplomatic functions described a soft-spoken intellectual who could discourse for hours on philosophy, mathematics, and the arts. He collected rare butterflies, wrote poetry that moved courtiers to tears, and maintained correspondence with scholars across the known world. Yet this same man had personally designed the collar system, spending years perfecting the balance between pain and functionality. His personal journals, discovered after his death, revealed a mind that viewed human suffering with the detached fascination of an entomologist studying insects. The Arvathian acquisition, he wrote with chilling banality, presents an excellent opportunity to test the theories of graduated demoralization I outlined in my third treatise on population management. Varkon's path to power had been paved with calculated brutality masked by bureaucratic efficiency. Born the 4th son of a minor noble, he'd risen through the imperial administration by transforming the empire's haphazard conquest methods into a science. His breakthrough came during the subjugation of the Thessian principalities, where he'd proposed enslaving the population gradually rather than through immediate force. By introducing voluntary debt programs that inevitably led to servitude, he'd avoided the costly rebellions that plagued traditional conquests. The success earned him the emperor's ear, then his trust, and finally his throne when the previous ruler died under mysterious circumstances, officially from a rare butterfly venom that Varkon just happened to be studying. As emperor, he'd expanded the realm not through endless wars but through patient corruption, identifying kingdoms like Arvath that could be rotted from within before being harvested like overripe fruit. The woman who'd enacted Varkon's plan, known in the histories only as Lady Nightshade, was perhaps even more terrifying for what she represented, the banality of evil wrapped in beauty. Born Serena Ashworth to a middle-ranking Carathian merchant family, she'd been identified in childhood as possessing both extraordinary beauty and complete absence of what philosophers called the sympathetic soul. Temple records showed she'd tortured small animals not from cruelty but from curiosity, genuinely puzzled why their pain should matter. This emotional void, combined with sharp intelligence and malleable features that could shift from innocent to seductive at will, made her perfect for Varkon's purposes. Trained from age 12 in the arts of seduction, poison, languages, and manipulation, she'd been the Empire's secret weapon in 17 acquisitions before Arvath. Prince Kael had been her masterwork. She'd studied him for 3 years through spies, learning every preference, every weakness, crafting herself into his perfect fantasy. The night she'd spent with him had been choreographed down to each sigh, each touch calculated to overwhelm his judgment at the precise moment the treaty appeared. Beyond these principal architects, the horror of Arvath required thousands of willing participants, each adding their own thread to the tapestry of suffering. Commander Marcus Blackfist, overseer of the collar distribution, had been a baker's son who discovered early that hurting others made him feel powerful. His innovation of adding sound to the collars, making them hum lullabies while tightening, showed a creativity in cruelty that impressed even Varkon. The emperor rewarded such initiative, creating a culture where advancement came through inventing new forms of suffering. Blackfist's lieutenants competed to impress him. Sergeant Crow developed the technique of making family members apply collars to each other. Corporal Ashenblade perfected the timing of separations to maximize psychological impact. Lieutenant Ironwood created the mercy game, where slaves competed in degrading tasks for the chance to send messages to loved ones. Messages that were never delivered but kept as trophies. The processing centers were staffed by a special breed of bureaucratic sadists, men and women who found satisfaction in reducing human beings to numbers and categories. Chief Administrator Delilah Goldridge, who oversaw the sorting of Arvath's children, approached her work with the detached efficiency of an accountant. Her innovation was the aptitude assessment, a series of tests that identified each child's greatest talents and fears, information used to ensure they be placed where their gifts would be perverted most completely. A child who showed healing abilities would be trained to tend tortured slaves just enough to prolong their suffering. Those with leadership potential were broken systematically and made into overseers of their own people. Goldridge's reports to Emperor Varkon read like livestock inventories, noting the yield rates of different breaking techniques with graphs and charts that turned anguish into data points. She was particularly proud of achieving a 94% compliance rate among children within 6 months, attributing the success to her policy of making older children responsible for younger ones' behavior. The empire's existing slave population provided another layer of enforcers, perpetuating cycles of abuse that the Karathians found both economical and psychologically effective. Overseer Dmitri had once been a prince himself, ruler of a small kingdom conquered 20 years prior. Now he trained new slaves with a fervor that surpassed even Karathian-born guards, as if breaking others might somehow restore what had been broken in him. His specialty was corrupting natural leaders, identifying those who might have organized resistance and transforming them into the system's most brutal enforcers. He would spend weeks gaining a new slave's trust, showing small kindnesses, speaking of eventual freedom, building hope, then reveal it had all been a game, that he'd been reporting their every word, that their trust had doomed friends who'd confided in them. The psychological destruction was so complete that many begged to become overseers themselves, preferring to inflict suffering rather than endure the weight of their betrayal. Yet even among this parade of monsters, some retained enough humanity to resist. Physician Garrett Thorne, forcibly recruited to keep valuable slaves alive, began subtly easing their suffering, adjusting medications to allow moments of painless sleep, accidentally damaging torture devices during medical procedures. Scribe Helena Winters, tasked with recording slave acquisitions, created hidden marks in her ledgers that preserved victims' true names and origins. Guard Captain Marcus Stone, sickened by what he was ordered to do, began allowing small mercies, families glimpsing each other during transfers, messages passed between separated lovers, children given extra food. These acts of resistance were dangerous. When discovered, the punishments were severe. Thorne was made to watch as patients he'd helped were subjected to redoubled torture. Winter's writing hand was crushed, forcing her to continue her work in agony. Stone was enslaved himself, his former subordinates taking special pleasure in his degradation. Yet others continued these small rebellions, proof that even in systems designed to extinguish humanity, some sparks refused to die. The true horror lay not in these individuals but in the system that created and rewarded them. The Karathian Empire had spent centuries perfecting a machine that transformed ordinary people into monsters and monsters into administrators of suffering. Every atrocity in Arvath had been tested, refined, and standardized across dozens of conquests. Manuals existed detailing optimal torture techniques, population management strategies, and psychological manipulation methods. Universities in the imperial capital offered courses in acquisition administration, training the next generation to view human suffering as a logistical challenge. The empire's economy depended on slavery so completely that even citizens who felt moral qualms remained silent, knowing their comfortable lives rested on others' misery. This was the system Prince Kael had invited into his kingdom, not a barbarian horde but a sophisticated civilization that had made an art of atrocity, a science of suffering, and an industry of human degradation. The transformation of Arvath from a beacon of civilization to a slave pen required more than Karathian brutality. It needed the acquiescence of 3 million people who outnumbered their conquerors 1,000 to 1. The bitter truth was that Arvathian society had been primed for subjugation through decades of cultural erosion that Prince Kael had been too blind to see. The kingdom's 8 centuries of prosperity had bred a complacency that ran bone deep. Citizens who had never known true hardship believed their freedom was as natural and permanent as sunrise. The merchant class, grown fat on trade, had long ago decided that profit mattered more than principle. When Carathian gold began flowing into Arvath years before the conquest, buying influence and information, these merchants had competed to sell out their neighbors for commercial advantage. The noble houses, supposedly guardians of Arvathian values, had become so focused on court intrigue and personal advancement that they'd failed to notice their country being hollowed out from within. Religious justification played a crucial role in normalizing the horror. The Carathian Empire had long ago perfected the art of theological conquest, sending missionary spies years ahead of their armies. These soft-spoken priests preached a seductive doctrine: that suffering in this life guaranteed rewards in the next, that authority was divinely ordained and must be obeyed, that resistance to one's fate was rebellion against the gods themselves. They'd found fertile ground in Arvatha's temples, where generations of peace had transformed warrior priests into comfortable philosophers more interested in debating abstract theology than defending their flocks. When the callers came, many priests actually helped apply them, telling their congregations that this must be divine will, a test of faith that would ultimately strengthen their souls. High Priest Mortius, who should have been a voice of resistance, instead issued proclamations about accepting one's divinely appointed role. Only later did survivors learn he'd been bought years earlier, his gambling debts paid by Carathian gold in exchange for his theological cooperation. The bystander effect multiplied exponentially as the conquest unfolded. When the first families were taken, neighbors told themselves it must be for good reason. Surely they'd committed some crime, owed some debt. When entire districts were cleared, people retreated into their homes, grateful it wasn't them, certain that compliance would ensure safety. The human mind's capacity for rationalization proved infinite. If we resist, it will be worse for everyone, became the common refrain. Better to cooperate and minimize the damage. Parents who might have fought to the death for their own children stood silent as neighbors' sons and daughters were dragged away, telling themselves they were protecting their families by not getting involved. This silence was contagious. Each person who failed to resist made it harder for the next to stand up. By the time citizens realized that compliance guaranteed nothing, that they were all slaves regardless of cooperation, the infrastructure of oppression was too complete to challenge. Economic incentives created a class of collaborators who profited from their people's suffering. The Carathians deliberately preserved certain Arvathian institutions, staffing them with locals who would do their dirty work in exchange for marginal privileges. The Merchants' Guild was reformed as the Resource Allocation Authority, its members growing wealthy managing the sale of their former customers. The Bankers' Association became the Human Capital Exchange, calculating the precise value of every slave and financing their transport. Former city guards were recruited as order maintenance officers, given slightly better rations and quarters in exchange for brutally suppressing their own people. These collaborators told themselves they were moderating Carathian excesses, that things would be worse without their involvement. In reality, they provided the empire with invaluable knowledge of Arvathian society, identifying potential rebels, revealing hidden resources, teaching their conquerors exactly how to break their people most efficiently. The corruption of moral leadership extended beyond priests to every pillar of society. The University of Arvath, once renowned for its philosophy and ethics departments, saw its professors competing to justify slavery through twisted logic. Professor Aldrius published on the natural order of servitude, arguing that some peoples were destined to serve others, that Arvathians had grown soft through freedom and would benefit from the discipline of bondage. The Physicians' College issued guidelines for keeping slaves healthy enough to work while minimizing care costs. The Bardic Circle, whose songs had once celebrated freedom and heroism, now composed work chants that helped slaves maintain productivity. Even the Mothers' Union, traditionally the fiercest defenders of children, fractured between those who advocated feudal resistance and those who preached adaptation. Their leader, Matron Cordelia, committed suicide rather than choose between collaboration and watching the children under her protection suffer for her defiance. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to reshape reality. Carathian-controlled news sheets published stories of slaves finding fulfillment in service, of families grateful for the structure slavery provided, of former criminals reformed through honest labor. They created false narratives of Arvathian decadence that supposedly justified conquest, stories of hidden cults, financial corruption, moral decay that the empire was heroically correcting. School curricula were rewritten overnight. Children who had learned Arvathian history on Monday were taught on Tuesday that their ancestors had been barbarians civilized by Carathian influence. Maps were redrawn showing Arvath as having always been part of the empire. The Arvathian language was banned in public, replaced by Carathian for efficiency. Within a generation, the plan was for children to grow up believing slavery was their natural state, never knowing their parents had once walked free. Perhaps most insidious was how the Carathians used Arvathian values against themselves. The kingdom's tradition of hospitality was perverted. Refusing to serve Carathian masters violated sacred host obligations. The emphasis on keeping one's word meant that coerced oaths of service carried moral weight even when given under duress. The cultural importance of hierarchy and respect for authority made it easier to slot Carathian masters into positions once held by Arvathian nobles. Even the concept of honor was twisted. Slaves were told that honorable service to their masters was the only dignity left to them. The empire's scholars had studied Arvathian culture for decades, identifying every lever of social control, every cultural pressure point that could be exploited. They understood their victims better than the victims understood themselves, using this knowledge to create a prison built from the very values that had once made Arvath great. The speed of societal collapse shocked even the Carathians. Administrator Goldridge noted in her reports that Arvath fell faster than any previous conquest, attributing it to the exceptional softness of a people who had forgotten that freedom required vigilance. Within 6 months, active resistance had essentially ceased. Within a year, the majority of slaves had accepted their fate with a resignation that bordered on complicity. Parents taught their children to be good slaves to avoid punishment. Former soldiers competed for positions as overseers. The kingdom that had stood for 8 centuries crumbled in less time than it took to harvest a crop. Yet even as Arvathian society collaborated in its own destruction, even as cultural leaders preached acceptance and merchants profited from misery, small flames of defiance flickered in the darkness. History would later call them the Ember Hearts, those who refused to let Arvath's light die completely. The first cracks in the Carathian system appeared not through grand rebellion but through the empire's own success. By the 3rd year of occupation, Emperor Varkan's economic advisors presented troubling reports. The complete enslavement of Arvath had created unexpected problems. With no free population to maintain infrastructure, roads crumbled, aqueducts failed, and the sophisticated irrigation systems that had made Arvath's farmlands productive fell into disrepair. Slaves worked to quota but had no incentive for innovation or maintenance beyond their immediate tasks. The golden goose was dying, and some in the imperial court began questioning whether total enslavement was sustainable. Whispers of discontent reached even the emperor's inner circle, particularly from younger administrators who saw opportunity in a modified approach, perhaps keeping a small free population as managers and skilled workers. These discussions, held in secret and punishable by death if discovered, marked the first fractures in Carathian certainty. More significantly, the Ember Hearts, that scattered resistance born from desperation, began to coalesce into something more dangerous. The movement started with Elena Brightwood, a former captain in Arvath's royal guard who had escaped the initial purges by being on a diplomatic mission when the treaty was signed. For 2 years, she'd moved through the shadows, gathering others who refused to accept slavery. Her followers included Darius the scribe, who had memorized vast portions of Arvathian law and history before the books burned, Miriam Stoneheart, a priestess who preached the old faith in hidden cellars, and most crucially, Thomas Goldfingers, a former thief whose underworld connections provided routes for messages and supplies. Together, they formed the nucleus of what would become known as the Chain Breakers. Their initial goals were modest: passing messages between separated families, providing extra food to children, small acts of sabotage that looked like accidents. But as their network grew, so did their ambitions. The catalyst for larger action came from an unexpected source: Prince Kael himself. The architects of his seduction had made one miscalculation. They'd left him alive. For 3 years, the prince had wandered his empty palace like a ghost, driven mad by guilt and the weight of his betrayal. The Karathians kept him as a trophy, a living reminder of how easily kingdoms could fall. But isolation and anguish had burned away his vanity, leaving something harder and more desperate. When Elena Brightwood's agents made contact, offering him a chance at redemption, they found not the pleasure-seeking boy who had doomed them but a hollow-eyed man ready to die for even the smallest act of atonement. Kael's knowledge of the palace's secret passages, combined with his technical status as Arvath's ruler, provided opportunities the resistance had only dreamed of. The prince who had signed away his people's freedom now signed documents that, while meaningless under Karathian law, gave moral authority to the resistance. The resistance's first major victory came through exploiting Karathian bureaucracy against itself. Thomas Goldfingers had discovered that the empire's vast slave records were maintained in duplicate, one copy in regional centers, another in the capital. By carefully altering records in regional centers, they could create ghost slaves, people listed as dead or transferred who were actually hidden in safe houses. Darius the scribe perfected forgeries that passed casual inspection, while Miriam's network of faithful provided hiding places. Within 6 months, they'd freed nearly 1,000 people this way. More importantly, they'd proven the empire wasn't infallible. Word spread through slave barracks in coded songs and whispered prayers. The chain breakers were real, and freedom, however distant, was possible. The psychological impact far exceeded the actual numbers freed. Slaves who had accepted their fate began to hope, and hope was contagious. The empire's response revealed both its strength and surprising vulnerabilities. Mass reprisals followed the discovery of altered records, entire barracks executed, children tortured to reveal their parents' knowledge of the resistance. But the brutality backfired. Administrator Goldridge noted a sharp decline in productivity as slaves realized they had nothing left to lose. More concerning for the empire, some Karathian citizens began expressing discomfort with the escalating violence. Letters to the capital questioned whether such harsh measures were necessary, whether the empire was becoming the barbarity it claimed to civilize. A few brave journalists in the Karathian heartland began publishing accounts of the atrocities, quickly suppressed but not before planting seeds of doubt. Even within the military, some officers questioned orders to execute children. Captain Marcus Stone's earlier refusal to carry out atrocities had inspired others. Small acts of defiance that individually meant little but collectively suggested the empire's iron discipline was rusting. The turning point accelerated when external forces took notice of Arvath's plight. The Karathian Empire's rapid expansion had alarmed neighboring powers who feared they might be next. The Free Cities Alliance, a loose confederation of merchant states, began covertly supporting the chain breakers with weapons and funds. The Kingdom of Westmarch, traditional rivals of Karathia, saw opportunity to weaken their enemy by forcing them to commit resources to suppressing rebellion. Most significantly, the theocracy of Solace declared the enslavement of Arvath a divine abomination, calling for a holy war of liberation. While none were ready for open conflict with the empire, their support transformed the chain breakers from desperate fugitives into a genuine threat. Ships began appearing off Arvath's coast at night, smuggling in supplies and ferrying out refugees with critical skills. The resistance established training camps in neighboring territories, preparing for the day when they could return in force. The final push toward liberation came from an unlikely source, nature itself. In the 4th year of occupation, a plague swept through the empire, likely originating from the unsanitary conditions in overcrowded slave barracks. The Crimson Fever, as it became known, killed indiscriminately, but slaves died in far greater numbers due to malnutrition and lack of medical care. The empire faced a horrible calculus. Treating slaves meant acknowledging their humanity and spending resources, but letting them die meant economic collapse. As the fever spread to Karathian citizens, panic set in. Soldiers refused deployment to plague-ridden regions, administrators fled their posts, and the elaborate bureaucracy of oppression began to break down. Emperor Varkon himself fell ill. Though he recovered, the weeks of his incapacitation saw rival factions in the court maneuvering for power. In this chaos, the chain breakers struck, coordinating simultaneous uprisings across Arvath. Prince Kael, seeking the redemption of death in battle, led a desperate assault on the central administrative complex, personally destroying the slave records even as Carathian crossbow bolts found their mark. His last words, reported by witnesses, were, "I was blind, but now I see what freedom costs." The prince who had sold his kingdom died trying to buy it back with his blood, though whether this redeemed him remained a question that would haunt Arvathian memory forever. The liberation of Arvath came not as a glorious victory but as a hemorrhaging wound that would take generations to heal. When the last Carathian administrator fled the capital, leaving behind burning documents and empty treasuries, the chain breakers found themselves rulers of a shattered nation. Of the 3 million souls enslaved, fewer than 2 million survived to see freedom. The others lay in mass graves across the empire, worked to death in mines, perished from disease, or simply vanished into the vast machinery of slavery. Those who returned came back broken, bodies scarred by collars that left permanent marks, minds fractured by years of degradation, families with gaping holes where loved ones should have been. The celebrating crowds that gathered in Liberation Square quickly dispersed when they realized most had no homes to return to, no families to embrace, no lives to resume. Freedom, they discovered, could feel almost as terrifying as slavery when everything familiar had been destroyed. The immediate aftermath brought challenges the resistance hadn't anticipated. Thousands died in the first months of freedom, their bodies too damaged by years of slavery to survive without the minimal care their masters had provided to protect their investment. Others, particularly children who'd known nothing but bondage, couldn't comprehend freedom. They waited for orders that never came, stood in food lines that didn't exist, searched for masters to tell them what to do. Psychological healers, the few who'd survived, were overwhelmed by trauma beyond their training. Suicide rates soared as former slaves, finally safe enough to contemplate their experiences, chose death over living with memories. The chain breakers established recovery centers, but resources were scarce and expertise scarcer. Elena Brightwood, now de facto leader of Free Arvath, spent her days mediating between groups of survivors who blamed each other for collaboration, for survival, for not resisting enough, or for resisting too much. The trials of collaborators and Carathian war criminals proved even more complex than physical recovery. The Free Arvath Tribunal, established with great fanfare, quickly bogged down in impossible questions. Where did survival end and collaboration begin? How to judge the mother who'd betrayed hiding families to save her children? What justice was appropriate for Arvathian overseers who'd brutalized their own people? Were they victims or perpetrators? The trials of major figures provided some satisfaction. Administrator Goldridge was found hiding in a grain silo, dressed as a peasant, her careful records of human categorization becoming evidence of her crimes. She was executed by hanging, though many felt this too merciful for one who'd sorted children for slavery. Commander Blackfist had fled successfully, but was assassinated months later by a former slave who tracked him across half the continent. Lady Nightshade vanished completely, her fate becoming one of history's mysteries. Some claimed she'd been torn apart by a mob, others that she'd simply changed her face again and disappeared into another identity. The pursuit of justice extended beyond individuals to the empire itself. The alliance powers, emboldened by Carathia's weakness, demanded reparations for Arvath. The negotiations revealed the true scale of exploitation. Detailed records showed that slave labor had generated profits exceeding 10 billion gold marks over 4 years. The empire, facing threats of coalition war, agreed to pay a fraction of this in compensation, though payments would stretch over 50 years and prove difficult to collect. More immediately valuable were the demands for information. Carathian archives contained lists of where slaves had been sent, which families had been separated, who had died where. The process of reunification began, though for every joyful reunion, 10 families learned their loved ones were gone forever. Ships arrived weekly carrying survivors from across the empire, each telling stories that added to the catalog of horrors. Yet even as Arvath struggled with recovery and justice, attempts to minimize or deny what had happened began almost immediately. Carathian historians started crafting narratives that portrayed the occupation as a mutual economic arrangement that had been exaggerated by Arvathian propaganda. They pointed to slaves who'd been treated relatively well, to infrastructure projects completed with slave labor, to the civilizing influence of Carathian administration. Some Arvathian collaborators, seeking to escape judgment, promoted these narratives, claiming the resistance had exaggerated suffering for political gain. Documents were destroyed or hidden, witnesses intimidated or bribed, and the clear historical record began to blur. Within a decade, Carathian schools were teaching that Arvath had invited economic partnership that had been mismanaged by corrupt local administrators. The empire accepted no fundamental responsibility, treating the entire episode as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than systematic atrocity. The survivors fought back against this erasure with the only weapon they had, memory. The Testament Project, initiated by Darius the scribe before his death, collected first-hand accounts from survivors while they still lived. Scribes traveled to every village, recording stories in the speaker's own words, preserving dialects and details that official histories might smooth away. Artists who'd survived created memorial sculptures from melted collar iron, each piece incorporating elements that told individual stories. The Children's Archive collected drawings and writings from young survivors, their crude illustrations often capturing horrors that words couldn't convey. Most powerfully, the annual remembrance began, a day when survivors would gather to speak names of the lost, a recitation that took hours and grew shorter each year as voices fell silent. These efforts faced constant challenges from those who wanted to move forward and forget the past. But survivors insisted that forgetting was a luxury only those who hadn't suffered could afford. The physical scars of occupation proved easier to address than the psychological ones. International aid helped rebuild infrastructure, new governments established laws protecting human rights, and the economy slowly recovered. But the deeper wounds festered. Families remained broken by betrayals during occupation, siblings who'd informed on each other, spouses who'd chosen survival over loyalty, children who'd been forced to watch parents humiliate themselves. The concept of trust itself had been shattered. Communities that had once celebrated together now harbored suspicions about who had collaborated, who had profited, who had escaped suffering while others endured it. Mental illness, virtually unknown in pre-conquest Arvath, became endemic. Terms had to be invented for conditions that hadn't existed before: collar syndrome, for those who still felt phantom pressure on their necks; separation terrors, for those who couldn't let loved ones out of sight; survivor's guilt, for those who'd lived while others died. Perhaps most tragically, the generation born into slavery struggled most with freedom. These children, some now young adults, had been shaped entirely by bondage. They knew no songs but work chants, no stories but cautionary tales about resistance, no identity beyond their slave categories. Efforts to educate them in Arvathian history and culture often failed. How could they take pride in a heritage that had failed to protect them? Many drifted into crime or addiction, seeking in violence or oblivion the structure that slavery had provided. Others achieved success but remained hollow, going through motions of normal life without ever truly feeling free. The Chainbreakers established special programs for these lost generation youth, but resources were limited and trauma ran deep. Some found healing through helping others, becoming the fiercest advocates for human rights. Others remained forever trapped between two worlds, no longer slaves but never truly free, living reminders of freedom's price. The fall of Arvath fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization, though not in ways Prince Kael could have imagined when he pressed his seal to that cursed treaty. Within a generation, every major power had reformed their laws regarding sovereignty and conquest, terrified that their own rulers might prove similarly weak. The doctrine of collective royal responsibility emerged, making entire noble families accountable for treaties signed by any member. If one prince could doom a kingdom, then all who might inherit must be vigilant. Universities established mandatory courses in resistance to corruption for future leaders, using Kael's seduction as the primary case study. The very nature of diplomatic negotiations changed, with strict protocols requiring multiple witnesses, waiting periods, and council approval for any agreement affecting national sovereignty. Yet these reforms came too late for the dozens of smaller kingdoms that fell to similar tactics in the decades following Arvath, their rulers having learned too well from Kael's example of how easily freedom could be bargained away. The legal revolution sparked by Arvath's suffering reached even further. The International Convention on Human Dignity, signed 50 years after liberation, established for the first time that certain rights were inherent to all people regardless of citizenship or circumstance. The document's preamble referenced the horrors of Arvath as proof that civilization required universal standards. Slavery was declared a crime against humanity itself, punishable by international intervention. The collar prohibition became so fundamental that even possessing designs for such devices carried severe penalties. Yet enforcement proved inconsistent. Powerful nations found ways to create indentured servitude or criminal labor programs that skirted the letter while violating the spirit of these laws. The Arvathian Survivors' Council spent decades challenging these hypocrisies, their moral authority derived from suffering giving weight to arguments that comfortable diplomats couldn't make. Archaeological discoveries in recent centuries have revealed layers of horror that even survivors hadn't fully grasped. The excavation of Processing Center 7 unearthed detailed records thought destroyed, including Administrator Goldridge's private experiments in breaking human will. Her notes described techniques of psychological manipulation so effective that some modern nations classified them as information too dangerous for public release. Mass grave sites continued to be discovered, each adding thousands to the death toll, now estimated at approaching 2 million. Most chilling were the children's training facilities, where young slaves were conditioned using methods that modern psychologists recognized as precursors to contemporary brainwashing techniques. The discovery that modern interrogation methods could trace their origins to Carathian slave-breaking procedures sparked international controversy and demands for reform that continue today. Contemporary parallels to Arvath's fate appear with disturbing regularity, though rarely with such dramatic clarity. Economic slavery through debt bondage affects millions globally, following patterns the Carathians would recognize: initial loans, impossible interest rates, generations trapped in servitude. Human trafficking networks use psychological manipulation techniques refined from those documented in Arvathian records. Modern technology enables surveillance and control that would have awed Emperor Varkon, with digital collars of debt, documentation, and dependency replacing iron ones. Democratic nations vote away freedoms for security or comfort, each small surrender echoing Prince Kael's grand betrayal. The Arvathian Memorial Foundation tracks these parallels, issuing annual warnings about societies sliding towards systemic oppression, though their reports often go unheeded until too late. Warning signs identified by survivors remain depressingly relevant. The normalization of cruelty begins small: jokes about certain people deserving less, acceptance of necessary harsh measures, the gradual dehumanization of the vulnerable. Economic inequality reaches levels where the wealthy see the poor as different species. Education systems stop teaching critical thinking and history, producing citizens unable to recognize patterns of oppression. Leaders emerge who promise simple solutions to complex problems, often involving the sacrifice of others' rights. Religious and civic institutions prioritize comfort over conscience, preaching acceptance rather than resistance. Media becomes entertainment rather than information, distracting from serious issues with spectacle. Each element alone seems harmless, but together they create conditions where a single moment of weakness, a treaty signed in passion, a vote cast in fear, a freedom traded for false security, can doom millions. The bitter lesson of Arvath is that civilization is not an achievement but a choice made daily by every citizen. The kingdom's 8 centuries of prosperity meant nothing when tested by determined evil and internal weakness. Every freedom enjoyed today exists because someone fought for it yesterday and someone must defend it tomorrow. The collar waits in many forms: debt, addiction, ignorance, apathy, the small surrenders that accumulate into servitude. Modern citizens live surrounded by systems that could become oppressive overnight given the right conditions, the wrong leaders, or simple inattention. The technology to track, control, and exploit has advanced far beyond Carathian imagination. What hasn't advanced is human nature, still capable of both transcendent courage and abject cowardice, still vulnerable to manipulation and seduction, still prone to trading others' freedom for personal comfort. The true tragedy of Prince Kael lies not in his unique weakness but in his terrible ordinariness. Every generation produces leaders who would sell their people for personal gain, citizens who would collaborate rather than resist, societies that would rather adapt to oppression than fight it. The miracle is not that Arvath fell but that it ever stood free at all, that for 800 years its people managed to resist the forces that eventually consumed them. The chain breakers who fought for liberation showed that even in humanity's darkest moments, some refused to accept slavery as inevitable. Their legacy challenges every comfortable citizen who believes atrocity couldn't happen here, couldn't happen now, couldn't happen to them. History suggests otherwise. Freedom is rare, oppression common, and the distance between them can be measured in a single signature on a treaty signed in the sweet intoxication of a pleasure that seems, in that moment, worth any price. Prince Kael died believing his final acts of resistance might earn redemption, but history renders a harsher verdict. He remains eternally frozen at that moment of choice, the young man who held 3 million lives in his hand and traded them for a night's pleasure. Every child born into slavery because of his weakness, every family destroyed, every death in the mines and markets stands as testimony to the price of his decision. Yet perhaps that is his truest legacy, not redemption but warning. In every leader's moment of temptation, in every citizen's choice between resistance and collaboration, in every society's drift toward accepting the unacceptable, Prince Kael's ghost whispers across the centuries. I was young, I was weak, I was human, and that was enough to doom us all. The ruins of the Palace of Eternal Spring still stand in modern Arvath, preserved as a monument to freedom's fragility. Tour guides show visitors the chamber where the treaty was signed, the bed where a kingdom was bartered, the window from which Prince Kael would have seen the first slave ships arriving had he bothered to look. School children file through in solemn lines, trying to imagine how anyone could make such a choice. But in the gift shop, they sell replica collars as souvenirs, and tourists take smiling photos at the signing desk. And the horror becomes history, then legend, then entertainment. The survivors are all gone now, their voices preserved only in archives few bother to read. The annual remembrance draws smaller crowds each year. The lessons fade, the warnings dim, and somewhere, in some palace or parliament or boardroom, another hand reaches for another pen to sign another document that will trade freedom for comfort, dignity for desire, the future for the fleeting pleasure of the present. This is the eternal cycle that Arvath's fall illuminated but could not break. Each generation must learn anew that freedom is not inherited but earned, not guaranteed but guarded, not natural but carved from the stone of human nature by will and vigilance and sacrifice. The collar waits, patient and eternal, for the moment when someone believes their pleasure matters more than others' pain, their comfort more than others' freedom, their moment more than humanity's future. It waits for the next Prince Kael, the next Lady Nightshade, the next Emperor Varkon, the next society too comfortable to see its chains being forged. The only defense is memory. Raw, painful, unvarnished memory of what happens when we forget that every human being's freedom is as precious as our own. In the end, Prince Kael's story is not a comfortable parable with clear heroes and villains, but a mirror held to human nature itself. We all carry within us the capacity for his weakness and the chain-breaker's courage, the collaborator's rationalization and the resistor's resolve. The difference lies not in inherent virtue but in the choices made when tested, the small decisions that lead toward freedom or slavery, the daily acts that defend or erode the dignity of human life. Arvath fell because its people, from prince to peasant, forgot this truth until too late. Whether we remember it in time remains an open question, asked anew with each generation, each crisis, each moment when pleasure whispers and conscience wavers and the future hangs balanced on the edge of choice. The prince who sold his kingdom for a night of pleasure is dead. The kingdom he sold is free but scarred. The empire that bought it has crumbled but not apologized. The survivors have spoken and fallen silent. All that remains is the echo of their warning across time, that freedom is precious, pleasure is fleeting, and the price of confusing the two is always paid in blood, though rarely by those who sign the treaties. Prince Kael learned this truth too late to matter. Whether we learn it in time remains the question that determines whether Arvath's suffering becomes humanity's salvation or merely another forgotten tragedy in the long, dark catalogue of our capacity for self-destruction.